Hi, welcome back to the Personality Hacker Podcast. My name is Joel Mark Witt.
And I'm Antonia Dodge. And in the past, we've made a mention of a quote I read in a book a while back, that we live in the most over-communicated time period in history. And what's fascinating about that quote is that the person who wrote that book wrote it in the 1980s. So here we are 30 years later, and our communication has exploded since then. I would say even like in the last 10 years, it's gotten to a place where I think most of us believe it's pretty unmanageable. Like I'm kind of, I suspect that we have not evolved emotionally, psychologically, socially to be able to deal with the amount of communication that we experience. And even as extroverts, you and I are both extroverts, Joel, even as extroverts, we feel burdened by this over-communication. How much more so would introverts?
Absolutely. And we've done a podcast about the introvert advantage. Some of the things about, there's an introvert movement lately. A lot of introverts are coming out of the woodwork, so to speak. And there's new websites and blogs and articles and all sorts of resources and books being written for introverts. And so we talked about the introvert advantage already on a past podcast. So go look that up.
Right. And the introvert advantage was that because introverts are in a time period that forces them outside of their shells, right, to be more extroverted, then their advantage is primarily in personal development.
Absolutely. But there are some challenges that introverts face. And one of the things that Antonia and I are both extroverts, like she said. We have a lot of theory and understanding of personality typology around introversion, but we're not introverts. We don't have the experience of what it's like to be an introvert. So what we did is we have actually a special guest in the studio with us today. Her name is Jenn Granneman, and she runs a website called Introvert Dear, D-E-A-R, introvertdear.com. You can find it online. And we invited her to come in and talk a little bit about maybe some of the introvert challenges, and one in specific, which is around this idea of communication. An introvert sometimes feels unprepared or unready for like conversation right out of the gate. Like they need to gather their thoughts first. And there's actually some science behind that. So anyway, welcome Jenn to the program. We're glad you're here at Personality Hacker, and we're so excited to have you on board.
Hi, Joel and Antonia. I'm happy to be here.
So before we get into talking about some of the challenges that introverts might have, talk a little bit about your website. How did this come about? What are you doing over there? What's this resource all about? Give us the inside scoop.
Ooh, the inside scoop. Okay, well, I am the creator of the site introvertdear.com. That's introvert, dear, D-E-A-R. And it's a community and blog for introverts and highly sensitive people. I began the blog about 2 years ago, and it actually started out as my personal blog. I wrote about being an introvert and an INFJ personality type. And I actually wrote it anonymously to begin with because it was very confessional and personal in nature. And over these few years, it's grown into what it is today, which is a full-blown community for introverts of all personality types.
Yeah. So this was probably a challenge for you to put your raw thoughts out to the world, right? Like you say it's confessional, but unpack that a little bit. Was it actually like deep, dark secrets, or was it just because you're like, this is something new for you to put out? This is how I'm feeling about this.
Yeah, I guess I didn't reveal any deep, dark secrets. So maybe it was only, confessional from an introvert standpoint. But I talked a lot about my relationships and my personal feelings and my experiences as an INFJ. And, as someone who maybe wasn't used to sharing that on a day-to-day basis, it did feel very personal for me.
So then getting into the science of it, which of course is always fascinating to me, what are some of the things, acknowledging that right now it doesn't really feel like the world is designed for introverts, what's the science behind why they're experiencing challenges in what, we just called the most over-communicated time period in history? What are some of the challenges that introverts are experiencing, and what's the science behind those challenges?
Wow, that's a really big question. And just now I'm having a lot of thoughts, and I'm having maybe trouble putting some words to those thoughts, which honestly I think is one of the more major things that introverts struggle with on a day-to-day basis, which is something called word retrieval. So it's kind of ironic that I'm experiencing that problem right now. But word retrieval means you're looking for just the right word to communicate your thoughts. And there's some science behind that, and it has to do with introverts using long-term memory and also using a longer pathway through their brain than extroverts do.
So basically, we're accessing as extroverts. What you're saying is we're accessing more, I guess, random access memory or more short-term memory that's available to us in the moment, whereas the memory retrieval for an introvert, based on the science that you've studied, is that it takes a while for the thought to get back out of that deep recesses of the brain, in a sense. So you're like, what's the word? I need the word. And you're like trying to get back down there. Is that kind of what you're talking about?
Yeah, the idea is that extroverts rely more on working memory, or it's also called short-term memory. And that's a quicker form of memory, whereas introverts store information in their long-term memory. And, the information is, in theory, stored there forever. But it takes longer to access those memories, and it also takes the right key or association to pull the right information or the right word out. So a lot of times introverts come off sounding like they don't exactly know what they're talking about, or maybe they sound hesitant or uncomfortable, when really they just need a few extra moments of processing time to pull out the right words and the right information to communicate their thoughts.
So my experience has not been that when I'm talking to an introvert like yourself and I ask a question, or we're in a conversation and I ask you something and you pause to retrieve something, my experience has not been like you sound stupid or silly or foolish. It's just that you're taking some time to think through something.
Well, and the interesting question there is it better to allow the pregnant pause, or is it better to fill the dead air, right, and give an introvert? I think as extroverts, we might think that talking gives them some space to formulate their response. However, it could be distracting. So what is the better strategy when dealing with an introvert? Is it to allow the pregnant pause, which might feel awkward to an extrovert? Is that as equally as awkward to the introvert? And is the strategy of just talking, maybe it's a bone that the extrovert is throwing to the introvert, but it's the wrong one to throw?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question, and that's probably something a lot of extroverts wonder a lot about when they're dealing with introverts. And I can't speak for all introverts because I think introverts have different personal preferences, but my preference certainly is to give me a few moments, just a few beats in conversation to collect my thoughts, just a few moments of silence. And I know if it drags on for a while, that can feel uncomfortable. I get that. And, I would also admit that sometimes when those awkward silences go on for too long, it makes me feel uncomfortable too. But I would say all in all, my preference is to just give me a few moments, not a long time, just a few moments to collect my thoughts. And I think you can do this in a comfortable way, or you can do this in an uncomfortable way. I think it just depends on the attitude that you take with it.
I'm going to throw you for a loop now and ask you a question about your community you built. So at Introvert Dear, you attract a lot of introverts to obviously read your stuff. What are some of the things that keep coming up? What are the emails you're getting? If you have like maybe a top 2 or top 3 or something.
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. And again, it's a pretty big question. And I think the challenges vary by introvert because we're all very individual. But I think the main feedback I hear from my community, and also the way I feel myself, is that introverts don't feel understood by the people around them, whether that's extroverts or just other introverts who maybe aren't aware of what introversion is. So I think there's a real need right now for introverts to be understood for who they are.
Why do I often get from introverts this phrase like, I feel like I'm not speaking clearly, I feel stupid, and I'm not saying something intelligent? When every time I'm around somebody who's introverted and they take the time to formulate an answer, they usually sound pretty smart, especially the people I hang out with. The introverts I hang out with tend to be intelligent people. Do you have a sense, an anecdotal sense even, of where that comes from?
Well, first, I just want to say that's really nice to hear that, I'm not as bumbling as maybe I think I am, because I feel that way a lot. Like I'm just talking and it's not really making a lot of sense. So that's really nice to hear. My sense of it is there's just so much internal activity going on with the introvert, and sometimes they're not always aware of how they're coming across to other people. So maybe they aren't as bumbling as they think they are when they're speaking. But I think it feels that way to them because just being out in the world and, speaking extemporaneously, that's not something that's natural to them. So I think we feel self-conscious because it doesn't feel natural to us. Also, I think there's a lot of introverts who have had negative experiences in the past with, having some sort of embarrassment or living through some awkward situation, or maybe even being bullied or, being hurt for some reason for who they were as an introvert. So I think there's a lot, introverts experience a lot of pain, especially when they're younger and before they really learn about who they are and what introversion is. So I think a lot of us introverts carry around some emotional baggage as well.
It's kind of like this thing, like at some point in your history, you were put on the spot socially, like, okay, Jen, give us an answer. And everybody's like, the whole crowd like looks over at you and you're like, I haven't had time to like really think about what I want to say. And so that you almost traumatized. And then now you assume like every interaction is going to be like, you almost have like a fear, or is it like an anxiety around being put on the spot socially?
Yeah, I think what you said is really accurate, actually. And as you said, being traumatized by social situations, about 100 different memories flashed through my mind then of times where I just feel like I made a complete fool of myself. And I know that's not exclusive to introverts. I'm sure extroverts feel that way from time to time too. Like they're saying something dumb or foolish, or, they just feel embarrassed about what's happening or what they did. So it's not just an introvert thing. But yeah, I think introverts struggle with that. And then they carry those memories around with them. And then they worry that it'll happen again because, as introverts, we're really good at, sort of replaying old memories and living inside of our heads. So it can become a struggle.
You mentioned before that there's an actual brain mapping difference between the way that an introvert and an extrovert is essentially wired. What are some of the ways that an introvert can deal with, like you said, the challenge of word retrieval and the challenge of having to access long-term memory in order to formulate an answer or to formulate a decision? What are some ways that an introvert can deal with that in a world that is getting increasingly less patient with those pregnant pauses? Like a world that basically goes, yeah, I'm going to need an answer right away. Even as an extrovert, I recognize that can be difficult even for me. How does an introvert navigate the world when the world is giving a lot of pressure around that?
That's a really good question. And I just want to back up a tiny bit and unpack that before I give some suggestions. So I think what we're describing here is the pathway that information travels through an introvert's brain versus an extrovert's brain. And research has shown that when information enters an extrovert's brain, whether it's listening to speech or seeing something or smelling something, whatever type of sensory information it is, it actually travels a shorter pathway through their brain. It's nicknamed the dopamine pathway because that's the neurotransmitter that's used in this pathway. Whereas when information enters an introvert's brain, it travels a longer pathway, and it actually travels through different areas of the brain and more areas of the brain. And this has been called the acetylcholine pathway because of the neurotransmitter involved. So introverts process things more deeply. So what are some ways that introverts can combat that and deal with that? I would say maybe the most important one is to just give yourself permission to have a moment to collect your thoughts and to be still and relax and to try to make yourself feel as comfortable as you can, even to let your mind wander if that's possible in the moment. Just let your mind go where it wants to, because one thought will probably lead to another. And one of those thoughts may hold the key to unlocking the words you want from your long-term memory.
So this idea of, feeling put on the spot is like somebody in conversation, word retrieval, things of this nature. How have you ever experimented with, like, even probably in business meetings or like formal work environments, you take notes? Have you ever experimented in your personal life doing that in a social situation, like you're on a date or you're out with friends or you're just talking to a friend or something, and like you want to have your thoughts, so you will just jot down a couple words on a napkin? But is that ever something you thought about experimenting with to help with the word retrieval? Because then you're anchoring things for your thoughts as you communicate.
Yeah, I think that's a great idea. And I've certainly done something like that in work-related situations where I know I'm going to be asked to speak about something or respond to something. So I'll take a few moments to either jot down notes or just to collect my thoughts in my head and try and order my thoughts in my head.
I love the idea of taking notes on a date.
Well,
I'm an introvert, so you're going to have to be okay with this clipboard.
you just take like have this list of stuff.
I've never taken notes on a date, for the record, but I've certainly been guilty of before a date trying to learn as much as I can about the person, and like thinking through possible things that I could talk to them about, just so that I felt prepared socially.
Do you ever run simulations of social interactions in your mind? Like, do you like rehearse how a conversation might go? Maybe it's a tense topic, so you want to make sure your thoughts are clear. So you actually simulate like how they'll respond and play out almost like a role-playing situation at home in front of the mirror or in the bathroom as you're brushing your teeth for the morning or whatever. Like, do you ever have that situation?
Yeah, all the time. And for me, it more takes the form of just envisioning what this interaction might look like and what are some possible things that might happen? What are some things that might be said? How might I respond if certain questions are asked or certain things are said? I do that a lot before a job interview or before meeting someone new or really just any kind of high pressure social situation just to get my mind primed and ready.
Does that feel good? Does it feel like it helps? Or does it, you think it cripples you because you have an expectation of how the conversation will go? And if it doesn't go how you've rehearsed, now you're thrown off.
For me, it really helps. And there's actually a lot of research around this that shows that taking time to envision what you think might happen is actually a really good tool for anybody to use. I mean, usually the conversations don't go how I think they're going to go. I mean, I don't think I can ever say that, oh yeah, that went exactly the way I thought it would. But I think that's not the point. I think the point is that I've done some mental work to prepare myself and that helps me feel more successful.
In our program, Profiler Training, when we talk about, profiling other people and determining type in active profiling sessions or even passively profiling, which is observing people, one of the recommendations we make is that when you ask a question to a person, you gauge how long it takes them to answer. Because introverts, my observation has been sort of as a behaviorist, that introverts hesitate before they answer. And you're essentially going into the science of why that's the case. One of the ways that we define introversion is that the inner world for an introvert is the real world, and the outer world is the world that's less real. And so anytime a piece of information comes at an introvert that, like if the outer world is giving feedback that doesn't gel with your inner world experience, that has to be reconciled. Like, why is the outer world not resonating with how I feel internally about this thing? And so I always assumed that the hesitation came from that moment of trying to reconcile these two things. Like the question may not be something that I've mapped yet internally, or the question might be throwing me out of my frame of how I see reality working. So that was my suspicion, but it sounds like, and I don't know if this is, contrary to that, but it sounds like the science is simply that it has to go through a lot more sort of loops internally to get there. So I guess my question is, because I love this concept of the science behind it, and you might not personally feel qualified to reconcile the science with our personal interpretation of what introversion is, but as an introvert, does that resonate with you? This idea of like the inner world being sort of the final arbiter of how reality works and trying to figure out why the external world is not resonating with your internal world and taking a moment to try to reconcile those two pieces.
Yeah, I really like what you said there. I think everything that happens for the introvert has to be processed internally first. And I think the science backs that up to show that, yeah, any incoming information literally has to pass through, several more areas of your brain. And it just literally takes more time to process. And yeah, things have to be developed inside of us first before they can come out to the outer world.
So then recognizing that, one of the things I've always recommended to introverts that maybe I'm coaching is to make sure that they're getting a substantial amount of alone time in order to do that processing. If you're constantly trying to reconcile two different worlds, that's going to expend energy, right? There's going to be energy expenditure there to try to figure out. It's almost like doing math all the time, right? Trying to figure out these two, like, why aren't the Why isn't the ledger matching up, right? Did I forget to carry the one? And so there's going to be energy expended there. So my recommendation's always been for introverts that they get the alone time that they need in order to, to have some space from that. So as an introvert, can you give me sort of your experience in needing alone time and what your recommendation to other introverts are for that alone time? Like, how helpful is that? How necessary is that?
I think that alone time is absolutely essential for an introvert to feel balanced. I think in that alone time, that's when introverts reconcile what they've experienced in the outer world. They reconcile it with their inner world, and it's when they finally have time to process their thoughts and feelings. For me personally, it's very hard to discover how I feel about something or make conclusions about something when I'm out in the outer world and interacting with other people. It's like I have to just kind of go away on my own and just let my thoughts and feelings have time to settle inside me. And, that should be done in a quiet environment without other people around, preferably, or maybe, with just one other person that you feel very comfortable with. I think a lot of introverts have alone time with significant others who they feel really comfortable with. That alone time is absolutely essential for me to feel at my best and be at my best, and really just to figure out what I think and feel about things.
Does getting that alone time help you enter the outer world with more confidence when you need to?
Yeah, I would say it does. After that alone time, I have more direction in my life, and I'm able to go ahead and interact with the outer world again because I feel recharged and ready to take on the world.
And then I guess my final question is sort of this question cluster around needing alone time. The opposite side of the spectrum is getting too much alone time. I've noticed that introverts figure out that trim tab of like, if I get enough alone time, I feel really good. And then the pendulum will swing over into almost exclusively alone time if possible, or they'll sort of cloister themselves off from the outer world. And can you give me, because one of the things I love about using you as an example of an introvert is that you're very well developed in general. And you gave me a look like, oh, thanks. But no, seriously, I find you to be a very well developed version of an INFJ. And one of the things you and I were...
Thank you.
Yeah. And one of the things we were talking about before is what you've had to do to develop your co-pilot process of extroverted feeling, or what we call harmony. And that is an extroverted process, so it's required you to get outside of yourself. So for the introverts that are listening, what recommendations would you make about making sure you're getting enough extroverted time, and what is the balance you see? Like, what would be a good balance for an introvert with getting enough alone time and then also making sure that they don't cloister themselves away?
I think that's a really good point that you bring up, that we do need a balance of both alone time and, maybe what we could call extroverted time. Although I don't know that introverts would want to think of it as extroverted time, but it's just time that's out in the world and out with other people and experiencing new things, even if it's a little bit outside of your comfort zone. And I actually experienced something like that this summer, actually. I was doing a lot of creative work on my own. I was living alone, and I was just alone all day long. And part of that was really energizing. But then at the end of the day, I felt like, wow, I need to get out of the house and I need to do things. So I found myself just like calling up friends and talking to people on Facebook and just, talking to the people in the lobby of my apartment building. Here, I just felt like I was an extrovert all of a sudden because I was just reaching out to people in any way. So it's really important to keep that balance. You need to have a balance of both.
So then it's a matter of giving yourself permission to have that alone time, but then also not getting indulgent.
Yeah, I think indulgent is the key word there, because a lot of introverts will shut themselves away from other people or from the world, and then you're missing out on some things that life has to offer. So you need to keep a balance of both.
A few introvert people have told me they feel hostility from extroverts just by going through the world. They almost feel like we're stepping on toes. One of my friends, who is also an INFJ, said she might be out, in a quiet place watching a sunset, and all of a sudden a group of extroverts will walk into the scene where she's sitting there and just interrupt her solitude and her quiet time and
creating noise pollution.
Yeah, creating noise pollution. Almost like you're being assaulted by people that are bombastic and outgoing. And I think from that, I've noticed some writing online. There's some hostility. It's like, extroverts, you should all be rounded up and put underground, or the world would be so much better if, like this entire part of the population be gone. That's not everybody, I mean, and sometimes it's hyperbolic, right? Do you sense that from your community, A? And do you have anything to say about that?
Oh, yes, I have things to say about that. I think you're absolutely right that introverts do feel some hostility sometimes. And what you were talking about with noise pollution and extroverts sort of encroaching on introverts, just having a peaceful day or whatever. I think that kind of depends on the introvert's frame of mind. Like maybe if it was me during the summer who was really reaching out and craving some connection with other people, I wouldn't have minded it. I would have welcomed some extroverted intrusion into my life because that's where I was at. I was filled up. I'd had plenty of alone time and I was recharged and I was ready to take on the outer world and connect with other people. But then, there's kind of the flip side of that where if let's just say you've worked all day in a job where you have to interact with a lot of people, maybe it was a stressful day, or maybe you're coming off of a long weekend where you had a lot of social plans and you're just an introvert who's feeling drained. Then little things will annoy me. And I think that's probably true for other introverts too. Like little things like, extroverts being really enthusiastic or, creating noise pollution. Those little things that maybe wouldn't annoy me in another state of mind become really bothersome.
That is, I think the principle of what you're saying is a great principle to apply to everything. And that is when we're not getting our needs met, other people drive us crazy because we're already drained in whatever way that we're drained. And so the idea of introverts feeling hostility towards, it doesn't even have to be an extrovert. It could be possibly a talkative introvert at the moment. It's just anybody who's not honoring the need for solitude or the need for quiet that this introvert is having, that they might not even actually know each other. So it's so important to make sure that as individuals, we're getting our needs met. Just in general, like just as a principle, all of us are getting our needs met and making sure that we feel full. And for an introvert, it's that permission to have the alone time they need, to have sort of that psychological nourishment that comes from getting some distance and space from other people. And if you're finding yourself more and more hostile to extroverts, it's probably because you're not giving yourself that time. So the more these things are rubbing you raw, the more hostility you're feeling about other people, it's a projection onto the other people that they're doing something to you. In reality, the way out is to make sure that you are taking control and empowered to get your needs met as an introvert.
Yeah, and the other piece about this too is there's somewhat of an awareness factor. Like, I would guess that as an introvert in your community, there's probably a sense of feeling like sometimes, and it may not be just extroverts, but people who are extroverted in the moment are just extroverting outward, and they're not aware that other people might be trying to have a quiet experience wherever. Maybe they're just quietly sitting on that park bench looking at their phone, and you're making a lot of noise, or you're talking loudly in a bookstore. Or there's this sense of I think a frustration from introverts potentially that people are not aware that, hey, I'm having a quiet moment over here. From my perspective, it's probably a sense of awareness.
Yeah, that resonates with me. I think introverts become frustrated when other people don't realize what they need and realize that this loudness or any kind of external stimulation is starting to bother them. But honestly, I think that's a growth point for introverts. I think one way that introverts can really grow is to realize that, well, maybe sometimes they do need to say something. Maybe they do need to just say to that person who is talking to them, like, okay, can we just have a few quiet moments right now? So I guess that's what I would encourage introverts to do when they're feeling that way, is to, in their own quiet, introverted way, to take some ownership of what they need.
So, first of all, I just really want to thank you for doing this interview. I think there's a lot of really great material and awareness around what's going on for introverts wrapped up in all of what you've said, which is great. Before we end this podcast, one of the things that I think would be great for our audience, because we actually have a lot of introverts that listen to our podcast, having done a lot of research around this, having really dived into the science of it, having written so many articles and resources for introverts, what would you say is the highest leverage piece of advice for an introvert? What's the highest leverage piece of advice that you would give to somebody who's who's trying to navigate the world as maybe a newly discovered introvert, or even somebody who's known they're an introvert for a long time and maybe is struggling with being an introvert in this world?
I think that's a really great question. And I'm going to go back to the idea of taking ownership of your own needs. I think when you're an introvert and you do feel filled up and you do feel recharged, then you can almost function sort of like an extrovert in the way that you can navigate the world and talk to people. But when you're feeling drained, well, I think all introverts probably know how that feel. You feel tired and cranky, and your thoughts aren't working, and your mouth isn't working, and just things are not working for you. So I think it's really important for us to recognize when we are getting to our max capacity and we need to step away and take some time to ourselves to recharge. And then maybe also in the moment, if there is, if you are with other people and you need some quiet space to yourself, just not being afraid to speak up and protect your own needs. And I think the challenge is that introverts are afraid that they're going to hurt other people's feelings by saying that they need to spend some time alone and away from those relationships. And also introverts just, generally don't want to rock the boat.
Yeah, and is the answer to that just not caring? Like, do you just stop caring whether or not you're going to rock the boat in order to get that alone time? Or like what have you done personally in your life to make sure that you're getting the need met of, getting that introvert time without feeling like you're constantly hurting other people's feelings or rocking the boat or whatever else could be the sticking point for an introvert to get that need met?
I think a little bit it is to just not care. And obviously there are some ways that you can go about doing this without hurting people's feelings. And I think the best way to do that is to just explain that these are your needs and it's not something personal. You're not upset with the other person. You are not trying to necessarily get away from them. I mean, you are trying to get away from them, but it's just to meet a need that you have.
I could see that being particularly difficult for introverts because rocking the boat means more reconciliation, right? The outer world, you're generating a circumstance in which the outer world will be giving you, or what you fear the outer world will be giving you, some negative feedback. And so that's yet more stuff to have to process. So I could almost see an introvert choosing not to get that alone time because they don't want to generate more of that having to process. I guess the best way to say it is when an extrovert gives you, or not even an extrovert, when people in your life give you some flack for getting that alone time, that flack now has to be processed, right? Is that essentially what it is? So now you're stacking things that you have to process later, and not getting the alone time in order to not deal with that flack is almost like the path of least resistance.
Yeah, I think you're right with what you said about the path of least resistance. I think for a lot of introverts, sometimes it's just easier to just subjugate their own needs and say, okay, I'm just going to deal with this fact that I'm not getting enough alone time, rather than putting themselves in a place of conflict with another person and saying, sorry, I need to just take a little bit of time for myself, or no, I can't hang out with you tonight because I want to stay in and have some time to myself. And that conflict has to be processed. And for a lot of introverts, not all of them, but for many introverts, I think, for maybe F-type introverts, that conflict is something that's difficult and uncomfortable for them. And it's something then that, you're right, they have to deal with and process.
Yeah, and the F-types are the feeler type of introvert. And so what's coming up for me is this idea that we train people how to treat us. So that path of least resistance initially actually trains people to continue to apply pressure in those social situations. So if you can train people that you need that alone time, eventually you don't have to deal with that flack. Is that what you've experienced?
Yeah, I think you're right. I think the people who know me know that I am going to need some alone time, and it's not something personal. It's just something that I need.
I can see a situation where, let's say there's an INFJ mom, right? She's got like 2 kids at home, a husband maybe that works a day job or something. This is just one random example. And she's like dealing with her kids all day. She's, feeding and getting to school or, taking care of them. preparing the meal for the evening, whatever. She's just going through her day and she's having to do a lot of activity. She doesn't really have any time to like unplug and go chill out. And then maybe her husband comes home from work later that night, and he wants to talk because he's excited to be back home, and so all this family interaction. Then maybe some friends come over to talk later, or she gets a phone call, and I can imagine that it's like this person doesn't have to be a female. It could be anybody that's at home in this environment. This person might feel like, man, I would feel bad saying I need to go up to my room for 20 or 30 minutes just to put my headphones in and listen to binaural beats or meditate or do some yoga by myself, because everybody needs so much from me all the time. Like, I feel needed all the time, and I feel like people will be mad at me if I'm not meeting their needs. And I think from my perspective, I mean, my mom was an INFJ, so I could observe this in her, watch her struggle with trying to get the time she needed. I can imagine it's difficult to not want to not meet the needs of the people around you and still carve that time out and feel okay about that, and not feel like you're putting other people out for doing it. You're not going to show up to meet the needs of other people if that's what your bent is, if you don't get your own needs met also. Like, you've got to fill up your bucket before you can help pour into other people's lives.
One thing that's coming up for me as somebody who understands like the cognitive function component of all the types, but particularly introverts, all the introverts are leading with a slightly different style of introversion. Some introverts need a lot of processing time when they're alone. They just need to be able to go inside their mind. I always call it, like, for the INJs, wandering the garden of their mind, just being able to go inside and allow the mind to take them wherever they want to go. Other introverted types, like INFPs or INTPs, or the people who are leading with introverted thinking, introverted feeling, or what we call authenticity or accuracy, it might be an activity they need to do. Like an INFP or an ISFP who leads with the process of authenticity, they might need to do self-expression. And they might need to be alone to create art. Or an INTP or an ISTP might need to be alone to work on something mechanical, or to do something that is, read a philosophy book, or do something that's really engaging their mind. An ISFP or an ISFJ might need to be able to do something very similar to an INJ. They might need to be able to reminisce, or, just kind of process the things that they've learned in the day and figure out how to integrate them into who they are. So all the introverts need something slightly different. And for some of the activities that they need to, in order to feel refreshed, it might look massively indulgent to the people on the outside. Like, you need to be alone to go create art, right? Well, really? You want to be alone with your music as opposed to be with me? So I could see there being struggles for different introverted types, that the thing that they want to do might not be something that the world is particularly honoring that activity in and of itself. And so when they seek that alone time, then they're getting a lot of feedback that they're being massively indulgent. And being willing to fight for the right to do that thing, right? Like you said, if you don't have a full bucket, you can't really do anything for anybody else. The old adage of, in the plane, you put your oxygen mask on first before you can assist anybody else. So being, having that permission, being free on your own mimetic side, right? Not waiting for permission from the outside world, not really caring about that feedback, but going, this is the thing that I need to do in order to be able to show up in the world in my best way. I think that's probably something that's a struggle for a lot of introverts, if they get the feedback that the activities they like to do when they're alone are not honored by the outside world. However, I think that that's particularly important to fight for. The more resistance you're getting from the outside world around the activities you want to do, the more you need to fight for your right to do that.
Yeah, and I just want to add that for me, what revolutionized the way that I thought about my need for alone time as an INFJ was to think about, well, if I'm recharged and I'm at my best, then I can be there and show up and be at my best for other people. So it's really just seeing how I fit into sort of the larger community and my relationships, and just realizing that if I can be at my best, then I can be at my best for other people.
And I think that piece of recognizing that if you establish that early on in your relationships, that this is a need you have, eventually people will stop trying to give you that resistance. Like, eventually they'll stop resisting that need you have. They'll just go, oh, that's just how Jenn is. right? As opposed to going like, Jenn, come on, come out with us. Why aren't you coming out with us, right? And the last time they gave you some pressure, you caved. And so now they know that that strategy works. And so they're going to apply pressure this time too. If you have the ability to go, yeah, no, not tonight. Sorry, guys. Well, maybe next week. I think I'm probably going to be cool next Thursday, but tonight, not so much. Eventually, people stop trying to give that pressure because you've taught them that this is how they treat you. You've taught them to not apply that pressure. So I think that's a really good point that you mentioned, which is, just simply by implementing those strategies of giving yourself permission, eventually the resistance kind of melts away, it seems.
I totally agree. And that's what I do recommend to my community.
Jenn, thanks for being with us today. I'm really excited to have introverts listening and extroverts that are listening to understand more about what it's like to be an introvert, what your community deals with. And you've built a great website over at introvertdeer.com, DEAR, not like the animal, but deer like is in deer something. And also your website not only talks about introversion, but you also talk about highly sensitive people. You have a lot of articles and research and things going on your website around that. So I love your community. I love the fact that you guys are here and you're representing the introverts of the world. And obviously there's a lot of other resources for introverts, but I would definitely recommend checking out Jenn's site, because I think it's a great place. Anything else you want to say? Any other places you want to direct people or anything like that?
You can find out my website at introvertdeer.com. You can also follow us on Facebook, Twitter, Tumblr, Google+, and Pinterest. We also have a Facebook group where you can connect with other introverts and highly sensitive people. So just search Introvert Deer on Facebook and you'll find us.
Fantastic. So thanks again for being here. And if you would like to leave a comment or ask a question about this specific topic, you can do that over at personalityhacker.com underneath this podcast. And you can also join our growing community of like minds just like yourself over at facebook.com/personalityhacker or twitter.com/personalityhack.
If you like what you heard, you can subscribe to our podcast, and also you can leave us a rating and review on iTunes. You can do so on other Android platforms, but we mostly get it on iTunes because the platforms for Android are a little disseminated. So the best way to let us know what you think is to leave your review on iTunes.
Yeah, and thanks for being with us this week. Thank you for being here and joining this conversation. We love having you be a part of this, and we hope you will continue to join us each week for the Personality Hacker podcast. My name is Joel Mark Witt.
And I'm Antonia Dodge.
And we again thank Jenn Granneman from introvertdeer.com for being with us.
Thank you for having me.
We'll talk to you on the next Personality Hacker podcast.